Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Thanks for being with us this afternoon or morning, wherever it is that you're calling in from. Thanks for joining the discussion today on diversity and inclusion in the NPT process. As the title of the event suggests, we will be discussing how traditionally underrepresented communities and perspectives in the nuclear non-proliferation space have historically contributed to and influenced discussions in the space, where there is more room to be, more work to be done, and how the nuclear community can go about better integrating these voices and perspectives into discussions on non-proliferation and disarmament and into efforts on non-proliferation and disarmament, both in the context of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the review process, but also more broadly. My name is Daria Dolzakova. I'm a research fellow with RUSI's Proliferation and Nuclear Policy team. And I also help work and organize on RUSI's initiative on rebalancing expertise in defense and security, or REDS, as we call it for short. And this event is part of the REDS initiative. The aim of the initiative is to provide a platform for and to encourage discussion around the better integration of underrepresented voices and perspectives into the defense and security space on a variety of issues, not just nuclear, but a range of issues in the defense and security space. This is the third event that we are hosting as part of the initiative, and I have no doubt that it'll be as informative and as valuable as the first two were. Before I hand over to the chair, I just want to note that the event is being recorded. It's being live streamed as well. If you have any questions about any of the presentations, if you want to contribute to the discussion, please do so. You can submit your questions through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we really hope that this can be an interactive discussion. So we are very lucky today to have the discussion chaired by Sebastian Brixey-Williams, who is the co-director of BASIC, which is a London-based think tank that works on nuclear risk reduction and disarmament. Sebastian is a researcher, a facilitator, and a mediator, and his areas of expertise and practice include multilateral nuclear diplomacy, strategic risk reduction, arms control, nuclear responsibilities, and nuclear weapons law. He leads the program on nuclear responsibilities in collaboration with the Institute for Conflict, Cooperation, and Security at the University of Birmingham. Sebastian is also a strong proponent of diversity and inclusion in the field, and has provided original thought leadership behind BASIC's Emerging Voices Network, and co-founded the Breakfast series that produced the Gender, Think Tanks, and International Affairs Toolkit, which was published in 2021, together with Chatham House and the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy. And I believe that's available online for anyone who's interested. That publication is there, and really a valuable tool and a valuable resource. Sebastian is a gender champion in nuclear policy, an ELN mentor, and a member of the Younger Generation Leadership Network on Euro-Atlantic Security. Over 2020 and 2021, he was an N-Square Fellow working to improve the sustainability of the nuclear policy field. So Sebastian is very accomplished, very experienced in this field. He has many more accomplishments that I wish I could get through, but I will forego that in favor of actually giving him the floor and letting him introduce the panelists and getting the discussion started. So Sebastian, the virtual floor is all yours.
Thank you, Daria, and hello, everybody. It's very nice to see you. And welcome to today's event on diversity and inclusion in the Non-Proliferation Treaty process. I'm very excited to be here with you all today for this incredibly important topic of conversation, which really runs through everything in the nuclear policy space. So no matter whether you're working on deterrence, disarmament, non-proliferation, peaceful uses, equity, diversity, and inclusion issues cut across them all. And whether that's focusing on the number of, say, women or people of color in our organizations, our delegations, or in the field more generally, and how much they get to speak, even when they're sitting around the table, i.e. their inclusion. Or whether that's using gender-based analysis, or you're trying to unearth structural racism in a more critical way. Diversity and inclusion is something that we can all engage with and something that we should all care about. And there are multiple reasons we should care about it. First and foremost, it's about equity and fairness. It provides the lens with which to uncover prejudice and barriers to people's participation in the field, which might otherwise be hampered by their physical traits or their background in ways that they simply cannot control. We aspire to live in an equal society, and that's enough to mean that this is something that everyone should be working on. And moreover, there are strong practical reasons why we should care about diversity and inclusion within the collaborative space of nuclear policy. And at this point, I think it's helpful to distinguish, as the journalist Matthew Syed does, between demographic diversity and cognitive diversity. So demographic diversity is about your background, your gender identity, your race, your class, and so on. Whereas cognitive diversity is about having a group of people who think differently. And although a demographically diverse group is very often a cognitively diverse group, we should keep these two categories conceptually separate, on the basis that simply having demographic diversity does not guarantee cognitive diversity, or vice versa. So for a group might be populated by people, for example, who have very different backgrounds but believe in a common ideology. That group might be demographically diverse but cognitively homogeneous, and so on. I mention all this because both of these dimensions feed into the practical reasons why we should care about diversity and inclusion in nuclear policy. First, having greater demographic diversity in the field means that a greater number of constituencies are likely to be represented in some form or other in the policy-making process. Contrast this to the traditional pale male stale defence and security field. If there are more women working in the field, it's much more likely that women's concerns will be integrated into the end result policy. And in the context of negotiations, those that ensure the inclusion of a greater number of stakeholders around the table are likely to produce more tailored and sustainable agreements. But in recent years, it's also become abundantly clear, supported by a rapidly growing body of evidence, that more cognitively diverse teams produce better outcomes. That has clear relevance for the NPT. The diverse teams can look at problems from more angles, can cross-fertilize in more interesting ways, come up with more ideas, and crucially head off the bad ones. So if you're running a workshop, one of the best things you can do to ensure that everyone is as different as possible from everyone else. So to summarize, not only should you care about diversity and inclusion in its own right from a fairness perspective, and that's the argument we should always lead with, but it will also come back to benefit you. And in today's panel, we'll try to unpack some of those dimensions. Before I introduce the panel, I thought I'd briefly contextualize my own work in this space. So my work and basics work on the topics of gender and youth participation, particularly in relation to nuclear policy, date back to 2016. When I helped found what was then called our Gender and Nuclear Weapons Programme, alongside three former colleagues, Rachel Staley, Tabitha Sanders, and Nina Sophia Pedersen. Our first event took place at King's College London in collaboration with WEWIP, the Women in War and International Politics Society, which was at the time co-chaired by somebody I'd never met before, called Marion Messmer, who today happens to be my co-director at BASIC and who directs our gender, youth and diversity portfolio now. Before Marion and I ended up working together, I also co-founded, also with Nina, a collaboration that Daria very kindly mentioned between BASIC Chatham House and the Centre for Feminist Foreign Policy, who do great work, and you should check them out if you don't know them already. We convened a breakfast series over the course of a year that brought together 50 to 60 people together from a range of international affairs NGOs to discuss how to improve gender awareness, gender-based analysis, and broader diversity and inclusion practices in the sector. Towards the end of the breakfast series, I handed on the baton to Marion, and together with Laura Dunkley, Asha Hurton-Crabb, and Marissa Conway, they produced the Gender Think Tanks and International Affairs Toolkit based on the data that we collected through the breakfasts. It's a brilliant resource, and I really recommend it to you most highly, and I hope somebody can put the link in the chat in a moment. Thank you, Daria. It provides very practical advice and tips for organizations in the sector to improve their gender awareness and practices, particularly in relation to research, events, and communication. In 2020, Marion and I became gender champions in nuclear policy, which means we refuse, period, to speak on panels, male-only panels. And I have to say this works. Since doing this, I've had a couple of conversations with event organizers who've invited me to speak on a panel, and I refuse to participate unless this could be rectified and this actually forced them to reconsider their approach, and women were subsequently invited to speak on the same panels. We also made 3 bespoke organizational pledges, which in addition to launching the toolkit were to increase the diversity of our board and to ensure all BASIC staff feel skilled up on our gender work. On the latter, we provided internal training and the use of the toolkit's checklists as part of our standard operating procedure for doing events these days. And with respect to our board, I'm very happy to announce that from February next year, we expect to have achieved full gender parity, as well as a marked improvement in our racial and geographic diversity. Within our staff, the proportion is now 75% women to 25% men. In the last year and a half, the focus of our gender, youth and diversity portfolio has actually been more on the youth dimension, though, something which is growing in importance in nuclear policy since the government of the Republic of Korea sponsored the first Youth Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Resolution at the UN First Committee in 2019. What became very apparent to me and others as I worked in a number of countries across 2018-19, when that was still possible, was that younger people in states that are less focused on nuclear weapons aren't included in mainstream international debate and often don't know their counterparts in the neighboring countries, even when they're right next door. The networks simply aren't there. And what that means is that these brilliant professionals are often quite marginalized. So from that observation was born the idea of the Emerging Voices Network, or EVN, which multiple staff members at BASIC have contributed a great deal of time and energy into developing and then operationalizing. And in this regard, I'd like to shout out to Marion Messmer, Marina Favreau, now at IFSH, Sophie McCormack, now at the MOD, Laura Rose Brown, and of course, Emily Enright, the current coordinator of the EVN, who since taking over the role around a year ago has made the network blossom. So what we have now is a highly diverse, digitally connected network of proficient professionals in the first 7 years of their career in nuclear policy, with a particular emphasis on bringing people from the global south into mainstream policy debate, and of that about 65% of women. Over 2020 to 2021, we had 7 working groups, each which produced a policy paper that's now published on the BASIC website. And we had a number of well-attended events bringing together young professionals with senior leaders in the field. And if you can forgive me for just a brief advertisement, I'd love to invite you all to attend the Next Generation Forum in the first week of the NPT Review Conference, date to be confirmed, but probably in that first week. Held jointly between BASIC and UNODA, but with participation from a much wider range of next-gen networks. We'll be working up some policy recommendations with this international group of young people, and then presenting them to the President-designate of the NPT Review Conference and other senior leaders a week later. So we'd love it if you could join us. But to the topic at hand. Rather than taking a sort of too traditional panel format today, we're going to have more of an informal conversation. And I'm going to be relatively light touch to allow our speakers as much time as possible to speak. I'll lead off with a couple of questions for each of our speakers, just to help contextualize their work in this space. And then we'll just see where the conversation takes us. And around 2:50, we'll go to audience Q&A. So as Daria has mentioned, if you'd like to ask a question, please do put your questions in the Q&A box. I won't see them in the chat, so please put them in the box. We're joined by 3 excellent panelists who are working at the forefront of diversity and inclusion in nuclear policy in the United Kingdom, the European continent, and the United States. So please give our panelists a very warm welcome. First off, we have Dr. Luba Satsabina, a research fellow in the Proliferation and Nuclear Policy Programme at RUSI, where she primarily contributes to the UK Nuclear Deterrence and Arms Control Futures Project and supports the work of the Next Generation Focused UK Project on Nuclear Issues, PONI. Luba also teaches on international relations courses at the University of Edinburgh. Her expertise includes applying critical security perspectives to nuclear proliferation, arms control and disarmament, mainly focused on Russia and the UK. Prior to joining RUSI, Luba worked for the Journal of Defence Studies and taught on several courses in politics and international relations. She holds a PhD in politics and a master's degree in global social change from the University of Edinburgh. Welcome, Luba. Our second speaker is Dr. Renata Hessman-Delacqua, the Programme Lead for Gender and Disarmament at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, UNIDIR. Before joining UNIDIR, she was the Deputy Director of Projects at the Brazilian Center for International Relations, where she worked for 6 years. And a recipient of the United Nations Women's Scholarship for Peace, Renata has conducted research and published on international cooperation on security, disarmament, non-proliferation and arms control, and nuclear energy governance. She holds a PhD in history and politics from the Vargas Foundation, Brazil, and a master's degree in international politics and security from University College London in the UK. And finally, our third speaker is Nomza Ndongwe, a research associate at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies and an assistant director of global recruiting at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. She's a co-founder of the WCAP's West Coast chapter and an N-Square Innovators Network Fellow 2020 to 2021. She has a master's in arts in non-proliferation, terrorism studies and financial crime management from Middlebury. And previously she served as a diplomat at the Zimbabwe Permanent Mission in Geneva, mainly focusing on the disarmament portfolio. So welcome to all of our speakers. Luba, I'm going to turn to you first because I'm hoping that you can help us set the scene when it comes to gender analysis. So kind of a couple of questions. Could you give us an overview of what gender analysis is, what it means, and why it's an important part of nuclear policy research?
Thank you very much, Sebastian. And it's an honor to be here today with brilliant panelists. Thank you so much for having me. And thanks, Sebastian, for a great introduction. So to set the scene, I'm just thinking before we, get to the main part of our discussions about gender analysis, diversity, equity, and inclusion, I want to start by defining gender. I think it's important to make several clarifications here. So I want to use Ann Tickner's definition. It's old, but I think it's still very, very valuable, especially in our discussion today. So gender is a set of culturally shaped and defined characteristics associated with masculinity and femininity that are not genetically prescribed, but rather socially constructed as a function of biological difference. So I want to make an emphasis on the socially constructed part, because I think it's very important with regards to how we proceed with this discussion. So gender analysis then is a systematic critical examination and a set of methodologies that look at how differences in gender roles, activities, needs, opportunities affect men, women, boys, girls, or non-binary persons in certain situations and contexts. So applying gender analysis would mean that states and policymakers can examine whether their suggested policies can help reduce gender inequalities and effectively address different needs from these different groups. So specifically, to connect this to the MPT, I would say that gender equality is achieved when rights, responsibilities, and opportunities that individuals have do not depend on their gender. So in relation to nuclear weapons, there are three areas of gender inequalities that we need to address. So first is the participation in the treaty review process. Second is the disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons use and testing. And third is the discourse that we use to talk about nuclear weapons, so that states use to talk about nuclear weapons. So in this sense, gender analysis is crucial because it helps us to illuminate and challenge various structures of power that sustain nuclear weapons. And my research specifically focuses on this third dimension, which is the discursive dimension, is how we conceptualize nuclear proliferation, non-proliferation, arms control, and disarmament. I think I will stop here for now, and then I'm happy to elaborate on any of these three areas.
Thanks, Luba. I think that's a really useful place to start, to have a common set of definitions on the table. And I like your three-part framework there, and I think we can probably use that throughout this discussion. Maybe one follow-up question I'd have is are there currently areas of nuclear research or policy that you see as lacking from gender analysis, but that could really benefit from better insight?
Yes, I think what we need to do now, we need more analysis. There is of course some groundwork that is brilliant. So I mean, of course, I think everybody's familiar with Carol Cohn's research back in the late 80s, Sex and Death in the Rational World of Defense Intellectuals. So I think what we need gender analysis, discursive gender mindful frameworks applied to states' formulation of policy currently. So for example, and there's been a lot of great work done on it, for example, on a lot of UK documents, even the integrated review. And I think we need more of that. So kind of the breakdown of the textual frameworks that surround nuclear weapons discourse, official nuclear weapons discourse, and specifically how we define concepts such as deterrence, strategic stability. Because what I find in various discussions with, with policymakers, etc., that we very much operate still with the old concepts like strategic stability or deterrence. It's still, it has not changed in many ways since the Cold War. And I mean, this is me just talking about the UK, but if we move on to Russian military doctrine, for example, or national security concept, there is, I think these are the areas that we really need to look at with regards to applying gender analysis to doctrinal text and to official policy statements and documents that states produce. So I think these areas I see as lacking, although there has been some research done, but I think we need more of that.
And I mean, just one follow-up question to that. What do you see as the main sort of interventions that need to take place in order to kind of get that process going? And we can come back to this a bit later as well.
I think it's about adopting a different kind of language. For example, the language used in these documents is highly gendered, and the definitions of these concepts are, I don't want to say old-fashioned, but I wouldn't, like if we talk about diversity and inclusion, they're not diverse or inclusive. They come from the pale male is stale, as you mentioned, Sebastian, time. And now we need to include the diversity of voices and perspectives to come up with different definitions. And I mean, there are already, of course, many groups and organizations that do this work, and I'm happy to talk about them later. But I think it's about how states talk about nuclear weapons, is this glorification of the use of force. And I think the language used in these documents very much precludes meaningful discussions of disarmament and arms control. And I think we should start by we should start with the language we adopt in our policies, and we should challenge the gendered language used in existing policies. So I think I would start with that.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much. And I couldn't agree more. I think let's come back to a little bit more later on to sort of what some of that language maybe looks like for some of the people in the crowd who maybe aren't so familiar with Carol Cohen and so on. But I want to get through everybody to start with. So I'm going to turn now to Renata. The aspect of diversity and inclusion we're going to talk about here is sort of gender equality and representation. You've done a lot of work on this, Renata, in the context of your work at UNIDIR. So maybe you could explain for us today the difference between gender representation and inclusion and gender analysis, what Luba has just been talking about, and why you think gender representation is important, and maybe give us a bit of a sense of how gender representation is changing in the field of nuclear research or policy.
Thank you, Sebastian, and thank you everyone for the invitation and for joining today. It's a pleasure to be with you and address these issues. So as you said, Sebastian, here at UNIDIR, we have this program on gender and disarmament. And I'm glad I don't need to address the concept of gender because Luba already did that very well. So the way we work is to look at how gender norms, what's considered as a norm for a woman, a man, a boy, a girl, or a non-binary person, how these norms shape the role of weapons in society, how they shape the way we talk about these weapons, how they shape negotiations around these weapons, and how they shape the impact of these weapons also in society. So when we talk about participation is the issue of gender norms and negotiations. Who gets to participate and decide on issues related to nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. And this is a very important part of the gender equality agenda because it stems from the recognition that men and women and non-binary people all have equal rights in terms of shaping the outcomes of decision-making. And we want to have a look and understand what are the gendered patterns of engagement in this field, but we also acknowledge that this is not an end in itself. So participation is a first step, but if we want to see new outcomes, fresh perspectives, transformative ideas, transformative policies, we need to ensure that there is diversity of thought, as you were saying before, and also that the issues in itself are benefiting from a gender analysis. And at UNIDIR, we try to do both. We try to work with countries to ensure that there are measures adopted that enable gender equality and participation, but that also they have the tools and the resources to apply a gender lens to the issues being debated. So when we look at who gets to participate, it's interesting because over the past few years, we have seen an increasing number of statements calling for the full and equal, the meaningful participation. And then we have also started seeing not that common, but also participation and leadership of women in nuclear arms control and disarmament. So at UNIDIR, we decided to do a study to look what is the baseline, when will we know we are increasing women's participation. So what we did, we looked at lists of participants across arms control and disarmament negotiations, and we were able to identify some trends and some patterns. What we found is nowadays women comprise approximately a third of the diplomats in arms control and disarmament. And there's actually not much variation between conventional or nuclear or whatever is termed as humanitarian disarmament and whatever is termed as nuclear non-proliferation. It seems to be that we are dealing with a kind of a same community that is actually active in this different fora. And women are participating around 30%, 30, a little bit more sometimes. So it's still very much underrepresented, considering that women are 50% of population. And what we see is that the gaps are wider in leadership. So men are always overrepresented at leadership positions, even to a greater extent that one would expect, given their overall participation. And I have some numbers here from the 2019 PrepCon. So the NPT Preparatory Committee in 2019, 76% of heads of delegations were men and 24% were women. And this is a bigger gap than overall participants, because at working level, diplomats were 71% men and 29% women. So this is a pattern that we have seen throughout the past 4 decades in arms control and disarmament. And what we also have seen is that women's participation is increasing, but if compared to other fields of foreign policy, it's increasing at a much slower rate. So for instance, in the 80s, women were less than 10% of the delegates. And now in after 2015 is that we reached the 30% number that I was talking before. So this is overall what we've been seeing in arms control and disarmament and in the NPT specifically. I think this is a little bit of the general panorama, but in the NPT, we have seen discussions on women's participation, but also, as Luba has said, ionizing the differential impacts of ionizing radiation, which already points to the importance of a gender analysis, because the way, at least I see it, is the differential impacts are one aspect, but if one could even think about exposure to risk. There may be differences that are mediated by gender. Access to capacity building opportunities in this field, or even access to, because the NPT, we shouldn't forget, also deals with peaceful uses. So it may be that their gender is also affecting the possibility of benefiting from nuclear technology. I don't know, but it's worth interrogating if the benefits of this technology, let's say access to medical treatment with radioisotopes, is something that where gender can play a role. So I think there is a range of issues that one could look from a gender perspective, and I think it has the potential of enhancing results on the ground, and that's why we advocate for a gender lens in this area as well.
Thanks, Renata. I mean, I think it's a brilliant piece of work setting those sorts of baselines, and I remember you doing it a few years ago. I wondered whether you've seen any kind of particular improvement within the context of this review cycle, even anecdotally, or whether really the structural problem hasn't really changed since you did the study a few years ago.
So we actually launched this study in the NPT PrepCon of 2019, and as you can imagine, these things take time to improve. But I think what are some indicators? I mean, we can discuss if there is a gender turn in nuclear policy, at least in nuclear discussions, we are discussing it more. If this has translated into action, it's still to be seen. But I think we have seen an increasing number of discussions. I myself participated in many events on this topic. But I think a very important metric is the fact that over the past review cycle, 5 working papers had gender as their main topic. And I think this is unprecedented. And all chair summaries or working papers, in the case where there wasn't a factual summary, acknowledged the importance of promoting equal participation in leadership, also acknowledged the differential impacts of ionizing radiations. And I also have some numbers that in 2019, over 20 statements delivered on behalf of more than 60 states parties addressed the relevance of gender perspectives in the NPT. So I think it is a growing conversation, and we should capitalize on this momentum to actually achieve some concrete outcomes in this next review conference.
And that leads me really to the next question of, what would you like to see happen at the NPT review conference taking place in January 2022 in relation to diversity and inclusion? Are there particular initiatives that you'd like to see sort of come through, or particular language you'd like to see in the final document?
I think we should work towards including certain language in an outcome document, and that would be building on chair summaries. Let's say acknowledging the importance of women and men equal participation, acknowledging the importance of gender diversity. I think that would be a bit harder, but we should also strive for that. And other things, I think perhaps a mention to gender analysis, because one of the working papers that were submitted in 2019 actually presented a sample framework for gender analysis in nuclear policy. But I also think, regardless, I mean, in parallel with focusing on an outcome document, there are activities and there are actions that state parties can take themselves. And that can be making sure that chairs of meetings consult with civil society groups, with gender experts, and try to see what are the relevance of gender and even intersectional approaches to the topic being discussed. Delegations can pay attention to issues of gender. As you said, do not organize or do not participate in a single-sex panel. Or when reporting back to Capital, make sure you mention these issues. Who was in the panel? Who brought gender to the attention? And this kind of things. And even encouraging, supporting, funding research on gendered aspects of nuclear policy. And perhaps I think this is something that other agencies, let's say the IAEA, could mainstream gender in their technical cooperation programs. So I think really we can focus on, I think the NPT review conference is a fora that we should all focus on, but we shouldn't be too attached to an outcome document. An outcome document is important, but I think there is a lot that can be done in parallel with an outcome document as well.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Renata. It's a great list of recommendations. And I'd really like to encourage our other two speakers to sort of feed into that same question about recommendations within the context of the NPT in a moment. But I'm going to turn now to Nomsa, and I'm hoping that you can help us broaden the discussion beyond gender here to look at wider aspects of diversity and inclusion. So I thought the first question I'd ask is, can you give us a sense of the types of challenges that are still hindering diversity and inclusion efforts in the NPT process?
Thank you, Sebastian. Thank you, Luba and Renata, for sharing this space with me and all our listeners or viewers at the moment. It's great to be invited to a RUSI event because I am a huge fan of the work that they do. Now, Sebastian, you were asking me to give an overview of the challenges that are hindering diversity and inclusion in the NPT process. And I do have opinions on the matter, but I did also want to just, make it very much part of the discussion that much like anti-racism work in other fields, putting the onus on the person of color or Black person to say, this is what you need to do to make it more equitable, is part of the reason why I think these conversations are important, because this is something that transcends whether or not I am from a community that is disproportionately affected by these policies. Now, with regard to diversity and inclusion in the NPT process, I think when we look at disarmament or non-proliferation as a whole, just the topics of disarmament and non-proliferation are basically topics that are probably closer to the hearts of countries or citizens of countries that come from countries that are not in the global north and marginalized communities. And I think when we look at the discourse that occurs within the field of non-proliferation, disarmament is one of the topics that I think, especially when it comes to nuclear, is not as prominent as arms control is, or safe, like nuclear safeguards, or anything other than actual like going towards global zero when it comes to nuclear weapons. And I think also it's important to note that disarmament obviously also includes conventional weapons and small arms and that kind of stuff. So I think, where to begin? Most of the populations that are harmed or have been harmed by nuclear weapons, whether it's the extraction of raw materials in the Southwest of the United States, which was mainly the Navajo Nation, or uranium mining in the DRC, or nuclear testing in Algeria or the Pacific Islands or Kazakhstan, to their one point in history but two-time use in Japan, have all been predominantly non-white communities that have been affected. And the fact that those topics do not get as much airtime as nuclear stockpiles do, or anything else that is considered. I read this great article that was done by Basic, and I just have to shout out the part where they talk about the posturing regarding nuclear weapons, relating it back to Carol Cohn's work, but also just saying, I think it was in reference to the UK's latest, integrated study or whatnot for nuclear weapons, that it was very traditionally like male, gender construct of saying nuclear weapons are what make us powerful and make us able to enforce what we want to enforce in the world and give us impact, and how masculine that is. So I would say when it comes to non-nuclear weapon states, or when it comes to countries or communities that are considered marginalized, when we talk about power dynamics, I would definitely say that just the fact that disarmament does not even get as much airtime, as much as people say, yes, we're committed to it. It's almost like it's a yes, yes, darling, of course, everybody wants peace, right? But at the moment, we can't really entertain something so frivolous or so, crunchy, as we say. Yeah. I don't know, Sebastian, if I answered your question. I had a lot that I wanted to bring in there.
There are, I'm sure, a lot of challenges. We'll keep it tight for now, but we can certainly come back to it and dig into it a bit more. Mm-hmm. I think it's really interesting what you're saying here about the marginalized communities who don't make it into nuclear policy debates, whether they're affected by uranium mining or other industrial nuclear activities or nuclear weapons testing, whatever it is. And the TPNW movement and the treaty itself has clearly tried to bring those communities into the debate more clearly. For TPNW, for those who don't follow multilateral nuclear diplomacy, is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It's a new treaty that came into force this year, and attempts to take a much sort of more radical line than the incumbent Non-Proliferation Treaty. So, I mean, it's interesting that they kind of that seems to become the space for those communities at the moment, and I think, from as far as I can see, the way those conversations are going, it's really going to be centered around the ideas of victim assistance and so on. But it strikes me also that we want to bring those people more into the NPT fold as well. And I wondered if you have any thoughts on what we can do to ensure that those communities are heard, but also can participate in the NPT side of things.
Was that for me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think I tend to lean towards Renata's gentle warning not to focus so much on an outcome document when it comes to the NPT process. So I also feel that as important as it is for issues such as victims of nuclear testing to be recognized, I also think it's important that we're looking at the actual actions that are being taken. So when it comes to marginalized communities, and especially I think if we were to talk about like the Pacific Islands and small island states that have been affected by nuclear testing, that most of their ability to sort of be heard comes through their collaboration with civil society. So giving civil society that seems to be more concerned with making sure those voices are heard, the opportunity as well to present their research and to amplify the voices of those people, of those marginalized communities, is important. I think you talked about the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons, and I think one of the most impressive things about that treaty was that it really was negotiated and created in a very collaborative space, which is very different from, I think, most arms control agreements that maybe came about during the Cold War. This was a lot more collaborative, and it was a lot more concerned with trying to factor in the voices of everyone, including nuclear weapon states. So I think that is a great start, giving civil society that opportunity to help in ways that I think member states have not been able to do as well, or have not had any interest in doing.
Thanks, Nomza. Yeah, I think that's great, and to me, speaks of a responsibility to listen to what those people are saying in those spaces as well, even if you don't participate as a full member state of the treaty. Observing and taking notes and developing one's own knowledge, I think, is really important. Okay, so we've heard from all three of our speakers now, and everyone's we've touched on some different dimensions of the diversity and inclusion issue. In the interest of making this more of a conversation, I wondered if any of our speakers, first and foremost, would like to comment on or springboard off something that one of the other speakers has mentioned. Did anything sort of strike you while you were talking, or while they were talking? Would you like to add anything, or can you see any connections between what they've been talking about and what you've been working on? Luba?
Yes, actually, I kept thinking about when you started with your opening remarks, Sebastian, you were talking about cognitive versus demographic diversity. And when I was listening to Renata and Nomza, this really raised some questions in my head with regards to achieving cognitive diversity. And I was thinking with what Renata mentioned, that there's been several working papers related to that utilize gender analysis, for example, submitted before the NPT RevCon, and I had a look at several of them, and I think they make really precise recommendations. But what I have noticed, though, it is largely focused on gender, and please forgive me, maybe I'm looking in the wrong place, but I haven't found similar papers that in such a clear and accessible manner address the intersectionality of this issue. And this comes back to what Nomza has been saying about marginalized communities and how to incorporate, how to boost these voices. It's not just about gender, of course. And when you were talking about cognitive diversity, Sebastian, you also mentioned if we all come from the same background, it's how little or how much can we achieve. And I was thinking more, it's not a question, it's more just what I've been thinking after listening to all of your presentations, actually, is about how to make sure other marginalized groups, such as survivors of nuclear use and testing, non-binary, non-Western, non-white communities, how can we incorporate them into these processes, because it's not just about gender anymore. And I think in terms of gender analysis, gender diversity, there has been a lot of work done. And as Renata mentioned, like she's provided some figures for us as well. I think it's great. But how can we improve this? And how can we achieve this cognitive diversity? These are the thoughts that I've had listening to all of your presentation. I think cognitive diversity just really stuck with me. I'm just thinking about this now. Maybe I'll come up with something in about 20 minutes, but I just can't get it out of my head.
Renata, go on.
Yeah. So at UniDear, I mean, we published a paper, I think in 2015 or something, about diversity in multilateral arms control. And we talk about diversity of perspectives. And there are some different studies coming from this same, what Sebastian was saying about cognitive diversity, about how diverse groups make better predictions and achieve better outcomes. So gender diversity as a means towards diversity of perspectives, but not the only means. There are other means. And I think the categories you mentioned, Luba, all make sense. And I think what ideally we should also be seeing is diversity of knowledge and diversity of experience. So in this sense, I was just, I mean, there is some new work trying to bring new voices, and not necessarily people that are familiar with arms control and disarmament, but actually trying to open up the field to new perspectives. And I think this is very important. And young scholars, maybe young practitioners, but also people with non-technical backgrounds also may be able to provide ideas and perspectives and look at the things at a different way. So I very much agree with you. What I think is that this doesn't mean that the work on gender is done and that we now need to focus on other categories. No, I think the work on gender is still very much, we still have a long road ahead of us. I think our research shows that continue at this pace, we will only see gender balance at the heads of delegations in 2065. So we shouldn't just, say, oh, let's wait, especially because, as we know, this kind of trajectory, it's not a linear trajectory. Gender equality is very much a political priority, and when governments change, political priorities change. So it's not guaranteed that women's rights and participation that have been achieved will be kept. We will always, in my perspective, this is something that we always need to pay attention and ensure that it's still high in the agenda. So I'm very, I think we need to be able to conciliate gender diversity and other types of diversity as well. But I also think we still need to push a lot to guarantee women's equal participation in this area also.
May I also jump in here? I do think that you're correct, Luba. The more pressing question really is how to make even those small advances that we're making, because I think Renata spoke about the study that they started in 2019, and obviously these studies take time. And as time is passing, we are seeing so many sort of worrying trends in the field of nuclear non-proliferation at the moment. So I think it is definitely something that I think about all the time to say, okay, we do need to bring in more diverse voices. So efforts have to be made in order to sort of give those voices the opportunity to enter the field or to progress in the field. And I feel like in terms of initiatives, there's quite a few initiatives that are very promising, whether it is in Europe or in the United States, where countries are trying to sort of make the access to academic education and also internships and training easier. So whether it's the organization that I am a member of, and I co-founded a chapter of, Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security, which has a UK chapter as well. And I'm sure Sebastian is very familiar with some of the folks there. Or whether it is the Marie Curie scholarship that the IAEA has now released for young women to enter into the field. I think these are all examples of ways that with time, we might be able to see a positive change with regard to representation and diversity of thought. But I also think there is a need for the institutional changes within the existing frameworks. And that, unfortunately, is a matter of the two words that everybody who works in international peace and security loves to hear: political will. So, how much of the current institutions are like, what are they trying to do, and not just saying that they're trying to do, but actually doing. And that might also involve, more events like this one, where you get to hear from voices that some folks might not have heard from. I think within the community, we all know each other because it's not that big, but in terms of the general public or potential people who might have an interest in the field, it's good to have these kind of conversations. It's good to lift as we climb, in terms of whoever's in the room. If Sebastian is in a meeting and says, Dr. Renata Hessman does really great work on this topic, and you should bring her in because I think she would give you a good perspective on something. Those are all, I feel, tangible options that we can also use to try and make that diversity of ideas a reality, as opposed to it being, oh yes, we've invited some women, yay us, and now we go back to the actual masculine postures and obviously I'm using masculine in the gender construct way, postures, etc. Yeah.
Thanks, Nomza. I spoke to the president of WCAPS no later than this morning over here in the UK. We're good friends. So I'm going to turn now to some questions because we're kind of approaching the last 40 minutes. And I'm going to take them in the order that I've got them here. So a good question from Christina Variale. Is the format of the PrepComs and RevCons in need of a reformulation? She's thinking particularly about how the public parts of the PrepComs and RevCons, especially the plenaries, are sometimes just expected political talking points, which on the one hand is not always constructive, but on the other hand, the current format does allow for states beyond the 5 nuclear weapon states and Iran to have a voice, and we can debate the level to which others listen to these debates. Is the current format still the right format in the context of diversity, equity, and inclusion? And what are the positives and negatives of NGO participation being virtual at the upcoming RevCon in this context? Anyone like to start us off on that one?
I can.
Thanks, Renata.
I can say something, I guess. So I think civil society participation is really important for the issues of bringing new ideas, expertise, and reminding states of the public opinion and, of their constituency back home. And also nuclear weapons are not issues, do not stay within borders, right? They are made to be used somewhere else. So I think it's important to listen to civil society from other places too. So I think, and public from other places too. So I think civil society participation is crucial. And in terms of gender mainstreaming, I think this has been an agenda largely driven by civil society that states have picked up later. So I see greater potential for outcomes that are progressive in terms of gender and participation, of gender analysis. I think there's greater potential when there's greater civil society engagement. So I think that's one of the, I hear this from different people, but I'm not sure if they mean it, but they say, delegates tell me that side events are actually the best part of the RevCon and the PrepCom. And so I think side events are really important. And especially when it's in person, in the sense that there's more opportunity for interaction and more opportunity for relationship building and trust, and all these things that are hard to gain in a virtual experience. But I also think on the downside, not everyone can travel to New York in regular times, right? There's an issue of resources, there's an issue of time, there are many issues, and not least climate change as well. So I think there is, we should try to make good use of the virtual tools that we have now. So I think we should continue to hold side events, even if the PrepCon is happening in this hybrid format, or all the uncertainty around it. But I really think side events continue to be very important. And whether there would be, I think, greater participation for civil society, when they can be allowed in the room and intervene in the debates as well. I'm not sure about the format, whether, I never, to be honest, I never really dedicated much thought to thinking about what could be a reformatting of the PrepCon and the RevCon. But yeah, so I wouldn't, this is the first time that I'm actually asking myself this question. So I don't have anything relevant to share, but I really think we should acknowledge and ensure that there is meaningful space for civil society participation, that's for sure.
Would anyone like to come in on the format question? And if not, I'll go on to the next question and you can keep mulling it over. Okay, all right. Well, I'll turn now to Rafael Moretto, who's made the point that the conversation so far has focused quite a lot on the sort of top official table, the multilateral diplomacy side. He's interested in the industrial players, particularly in various nations, and looking at the ways that their inclusion can be facilitated, and how to sort of to monitor and regulate their private operations, as well as to avoid, as he says, complicated flaws with the NPT implementation. I wondered if anyone would like to come in on private players a bit. Do we see the same sorts of conversations going on in the industrial sector?
If I may, I would just say that, again, I think industry as an actor is very relevant in different arms control and disarmament fields. And I think we should find ways of engaging with industry. I'm not sure if necessarily in the NPT, it could be, different multi-stakeholder forums. I think because also the format of the NPT runs for 4 weeks, I think the timing of industry leaders is a bit different. I would imagine they don't have that much time for debating these issues. But I remember, I think before the pandemic, there was an idea of having, let's say, a big side event with industry players and raising awareness about the relevance of the NPT for their activities as well. But in the current format that we are having, which is much more reduced and hybrid, I haven't heard anything like that. But I think the IAEA is a sector that engages, it's an agency that engages a lot with the industry. So if we had someone from the IAEA here, that would be, I think, like the best, the most suited person to tell about the different ways in which they engage with the industry. Unfortunately, here in Geneva, the multilateral processes that we cover on disarmament don't have that much industry participation so far, but I am aware of separate dialogues with industry, not necessarily as part of the multilateral process, but in parallel.
Thanks. Anyone else want to come in on that one? And if not, I think that maybe that's a conversation that RUSI can hold a separate meeting on at some point. You'd be a great place to have it. Okay, we're going to turn now to the next question to Anna, from Anna Alexandru at RUSI. Who's thanked all of the speakers for excellent points. And Anna says, diversity and inclusion are essential for substantive discussions leading up to the RevCon. Civil society plays a productive role in these consultations. However, Could it be that our existing processes are preventing us from achieving practical impact, i.e. we've identified some of the core issues, but how are we moving from changing the narrative to changing the practices? It's this conversation about rhetoric and behavior that's come up over and over again. And if so, where could civil society focus their efforts in the next 5 years? I wonder if I can turn to Nomsa first on this one.
Sure. I guess as somebody who has taken part in these sort of conferences and negotiations as a representative of a member state, I would say, much like anything that involves huge bureaucracies, expecting change to start in the UN processes or in the NPT itself is a taller order than one might like to admit. I do believe that for civil society, when I look at the glowing examples of all the changes that civil society has made in arms control and non-proliferation, whether it is the Anti-Personal Landmine Convention, whether it is the Cluster Munitions Convention, most of the changes, or the Arms Trade Treaty, a lot of the changes that we've seen in the last 20 years in the field of arms control and disarmament have come from that impetus that is created and momentum that is sustained, and the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons, right, by civil society. So I feel like when it comes to these kinds of processes, civil society continues to be the one that can lead or can pivot a lot easier or a lot quicker than the bigger bureaucracies of governments or member states or a UN organization. So I think, I would love to see civil society working towards educating Joe public more, because I think that's where we have attention at the moment, in terms of it being sort of like a niche field where we all sit around and we're experts and we talk about it. But if you're sitting on the tube, I don't know how many people in your car would even know anything about what's happening in the field of nuclear weapons. So I'm excited to see what civil society will do with regard to educating the public, and how that will have such a great impact on everything that we do within the more rigid format of the NPT or the bureaucracy of the United Nations.
Nomsa. And Luba, I'm going to come to you in a second about Anna's question, but I wanted to ask just one follow-up question to Nomsa, if that's okay. I'd be really interested to hear about your perception of how these debates are kind of happening differently in the US versus in Europe, or indeed everywhere else. As somebody who's taken part in the WCAPS initiative, which is such a fantastic initiative, and which has its chapters in various parts of the world, are you seeing different approaches? Is one continent further ahead than the other, or what can they learn perhaps from one another, is maybe another way to put it?
I would say, if I'm understanding your question correctly, you're asking whether or not civil society is impacting the conversation. Is that correct? Like, and how it's different in the US and Europe or somewhere else?
And how far ahead their thinking is, I suppose. Well,
I think there are common threads that we're seeing, and the ones where you have common threads, and I'm going to broaden the conversation slightly and then come back. So when we look at even the discourse on gender that has been happening around the world in the last 2 decades, right? I would even go as far as to say even 10 years ago, these conversations were not part of the mainstream. So sometimes, the conversation will be further advanced in the United States than it would be in Europe, or vice versa. And it's the beauty of the interconnectedness. And I think, we saw it a lot since the protests after the unfortunate murder of George Floyd, is that now, especially with the internet and with where we are in terms of technological advancement, it's a lot easier for a cause to carry from one part of the world to the other. It doesn't, the reaction time is not as long as it used to be. It's not something where it's like, oh, we've been working on this for 20 years in Fiji, and now it's relevant in London. It's now it could happen overnight. So I would say when you see things like WCAPS, forming chapters around the world, people subscribing to the chapters, contributing to the conversation. When you see the work that UNIDIR is doing and talking about, still behind the curve, or this is how we can connect the women, peace and security agenda to, UN resolution from 2000 to what we're trying to do now when we talk about gender parity and discourse. When you see a conversation like the one that we're having right now, I think that answers the question about whether, who's more ahead or not. You got Europe represented, you got UNIDIR/Brazil represented, you got Africa and the US represented, and you got the UK all in the same Zoom room. So I would say that I think it's going in a good place. And I think we are fortunate to be living in a time where literally like a cause can catch fire, or basically be the flag can be like the baton can be passed on overnight, and we can see those changes happening. So I think it's really about what resonates with people. And I think when I look at what's happening in Europe and I look at what's happening on the African continent or in the United States, I think that's something positive that we can take away from this conversation.
Well, without saying we should all put our feet up, I think that is a good source of hope, and certainly we should hold on to that hope. Luba, I'm going to come back to you now to sort of think back about that question that Anna posed about sort of moving from changing the narrative to changing practices and what civil society should be doing.
Yes, I've been thinking, just to add to what Norms has been saying about educating the public, mentoring, educating, raising awareness, these are all things that come to mind. And in terms of focus, what I've been thinking now, and I think someone earlier mentioned about lack of funding, it's about funding various initiatives such as RED's initiative, for example, here at RUSI. So my thoughts in terms of where to focus the efforts in the next 5 years is about providing more funding opportunities, because research, mentoring, education, it all connects, a lot of it connects to funding. And I think foundations, for example, as civil society organizations could be useful in funding emerging scholars or research in diversity and inclusion in non-proliferation and arms control, for example. And also I'm thinking, and it's a bit of a shameless promotion really for Pony, but it's the emerging Voices Network. Is these experts, emerging experts, mid-career experts who are having these conversations now, I think will be better informed in a way to contribute to future FCONs, for example. So it's about providing these funding opportunities and raising awareness for the next generation of scholars, practitioners, industry workers, actually, to come back to the question about industry. And I think I don't want to, don't quote me on that, I don't want to make a mistake, but I'm pretty sure we had this discussion with industry people about incorporating gender diversity and how it's incorporated in their funding opportunities and education and various programs in getting more. I think at this point the discussion was about getting more women in STEM research, for example. But I think in terms of civil society focused, a lot of it is about mentoring and providing more funding opportunities. So that's how I would respond. Thanks,
Luba. Some of us, well, those panelists and I were having a conversation before we went live about funding in the field, and it's extraordinarily difficult to get funding on these issues at the moment. There is generally, because the way funders are set up with kind of strict mandates on what they do or don't fund, this kind of diversity piece often falls outside of those mandates. So I would encourage any states kind of watching this to think about that and see whether you could ring fence a little bit of money within your bigger budgets to think about these issues. And we've got a few more questions in the chat. I would encourage those listening, if you'd like to ask a question, please do now. It would be otherwise at some point I'll have to close the chat off. But we'll turn now to the question from Jay. As long as nuclear weapons remain a security issue and not a justice or humanitarian, etc. issue, how can we ensure change occurs? The P5 are all nuclear armed, so meaningful change that seeks to disarm globally is unlikely to occur through the UN Security Council or the UN. What are our other options for justice and equality when the groups making the decisions have unequal power and vested interest in keeping the scales tipped towards them, maintaining and holding weapons? Anyone like to take that one on? Otherwise, I'll read another one and you can mull it over. Okay, the second question then from Eugene. Is there anything more illustrative of cognitive or thought diversity than two white aging males recently and currently in the role of US president? So if we accept this as a precept, what do we actually mean by diversity in this context?
I can say something about the issue of diversity at leadership levels in general, not only about the US. What we found in our study, Still Behind the Curve, is a confirmation of the so-called law of increasing disproportion, which means the higher you go in the status ladder, the less likely you are to find women, and I would say women of color even less. So, and then young women also even less. So just to say that this is a picture that you can find in different parts of the world, actually. And in our study, we looked at diplomats, ambassadors, foreign ministers, and heads of state. And you could clearly see the gap, the gender gap widening. So I think this is an issue of how the structure inequalities around the world, but it may be also that the ideas of who makes good policy are still very much gendered and very much linked with masculinized norms. So I think it's a matter of combating harmful stereotypes in our everyday work, in our everyday communication. And this goes back to the NPT. I think in the NPT context, for instance, states parties could ensure a more diverse bureau. So throughout the presidents of the different, of a specific cycle, review cycle, you could make sure that women and men are equally represented as chairs, which hasn't happened so far, and that women and men are equally represented in support functions, which is where we tend to see more women actually than men. So I think a conscious decision to ensure diversity in all aspects of our lives, and gender diversity being one of the, let's say, most straightforward ones, because as I said, women are 50% of the population. They are everywhere where you look. So it wouldn't be that hard to ensure that they are part of all functions in a manner that they can contribute across the board. So I think this is very concrete, something that states parties to the NPT could pay attention to. Is I think one of the NPT working papers said that out of the dozens of chairs, I have to quote here, out of the dozens of chairs of NPT, the NPT has had in PrepCom and RevCom, I think only 2 were women. So it's still very much a big gap in leadership within multilateral processes, and even bigger gap, as we say, when we look at heads of states.
I think that speaks to a campaign to have the next chair of the PrepCom or the RevCon, or indeed both, or all of the PrepComs be a woman. It would be a nice change, much as we've seen the campaign for a woman Secretary General. Does anyone else want to come back on either of those 2 questions, Luba and Normsa?
Yes, I'm just thinking about Jay's question, and I think it's a good question, but it's a difficult one. And of course, like I would struggle to give it a straightforward answer, but I think it raises this, it's about the hierarchical structure of the international system. It's about who holds power, and I'm not going to even go there in this discussion. But what other options for justice and equality? I'm just thinking. I mean, it's a slow process, right? There are a lot of steps, And of course, it's not going to be a quick process, but I would come back, like, just to sum up what's been mentioned so far. It's about empowering, we could say empowering civil society organizations. It's about continuing the dialogues on, diversity inclusion. It's about educating. It's about educating policymakers in the first place. It's about reconceptualizing the concepts that governments operate with. If we talk about, P5, definitions of deterrence, strategic stability. And finally, but this I'm talking, it's decades of work. It's slow. It has to be done in various sectors. But I think we have a good beginning. This just kind of not to make it all sound all gloomy. I mean, of course, we're still a long time until a lot of progress will be made, but there's the progress that has been made has to be recognized already. And I think, it's about, a lot of it is about education. It's about raising awareness. It's about more opportunities. It's about diversifying perspective. It's about diversifying our research, our approaches to research. And it's about challenging the concepts that policymakers operate with. So I would say these are the steps, perhaps, to justice and equality that Jay is talking about. But again, it's a very difficult question, and I don't think I can give an authoritative answer to that. I don't know if Noms or Renata can have anything to add.
I'd actually put something in the chat because I was trying to formulate my response. I feel like Jay was asking two different questions, so I had to break it down a little bit in my own mind in order to give them a response. So I would argue that the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons is a result of the humanitarian initiative about talking about the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, and the amount of support it got from member states and from just the public in general does show that some might argue that it's just a security issue, but I think the general public views it as not just a security issue, but, as we spoke before about communities that were affected by nuclear testing, it's a restorative justice issue, and then there's a humanitarian context to it as well. And I think as we've all experienced now after this global pandemic that does not want to end, these issues are so intertwined, because if we could be felled by a microbe, what happens with something as drastic and terrifying as a nuclear war? So I agree that, the more philosophical question is there a point in trying to affect change when, potentially the people who have the majority of the weapons are not interested in the same things you are. So their priorities are more to do with, strategic stability, et cetera. And we're talking about disarm and get rid of them completely today, tomorrow. What's taking so long? I do believe that the fact that those countries are involved in the debate and in the process means that they do care. It's just a matter of where on the priority list complete and total nuclear disarmament is. And the reasons that they have used in the past is to say the security environment does not allow for that to happen right now, or that it takes time. And I think if we are to take that in good faith, then we hold the line and we continue to push and we continue to hold them to account. So I know, Jay, that it's not the silver bullet answer that's like, okay, we've solved it, now we can all go home and put our feet up. But I think it's where I start from. It's the position that I look at it from, to say, okay, let's not cede more ground with regard to issues of disarmament or non-proliferation, and let's continue to push for complete and total disarmament. And unfortunately, it's going to take a lot longer than any one of us would like.
Thank you, Namza. Okay, we're in the last 10 minutes. So I'm going to close the Q&A there. And I'm actually going to ask 3 questions, which I hope everyone can hold on to or keep a note of in some way. And if you need me to repeat anything, I will. The first is taking my chair's privileges. I'm going to ask one myself, which is, most of the efforts at the moment in the field on equity, diversity, and inclusion have focused on gender it seems to me. I'm not exactly sure why that's the case, but I think we can kind of see that wider trend across the industries. These issues are not automatically approached from an intersectional perspective. So I'd say to our speakers, beyond modeling these things ourselves as best we can, what's the next thing that should be done to ensure a more intersectional approach? Do we need new campaigns? What's the next step? The second question is a question from Daria. What kind of engagement, if any, has there been between the nuclear disarmament / non-proliferation / arms control community and those working in the fight against climate change on diversity, equity and inclusion and representation issues in particular? It seems to Daria that there is some crossover in the disproportionate impacts of nuclear weapons and climate change on different countries, communities, on women and so forth. And then a final question from Emily Enright. We've touched on this at various points, but she'd like to come back to putting some of the puzzle pieces together in terms of youth, gender, and racial inclusion. It seems we're seeing a larger proportion of women, people of colour, and citizens of the Global South amongst today's cohort young leaders in nuclear policy. What do we need to do now to support that cohort to stay in the field and lead into the future, to ensure that diversity is sustained and future senior leadership cohorts are as diverse as today's junior leadership? Okay, so there's a question about remaining in the field, there's a question about nuclear policy and climate change, and there's a question about how we take a more intersectional approach within this field. Would anyone like to kick us off? If not, I'll call on someone. You can do one, and then you can handle the baton.
I can go.
All right, thanks, Renata.
So in the issue of most initiatives have been focused on gender so far, and what can we do to take this further and actually adopt an intersectional approach? I would just like to say that if we look at the past couple of years, yes, it looks like a lot has been done on gender, but actually this is a very long trajectory we're in. And it seems like, oh yeah, now there's a lot happening, but it's not now. Nomsa and Luba today refer to the work of Carol Cohn. Her work was published in '87, and it was actually in 2020 that got the most citations. So it took time, and it still takes time, effort, persistence, and a lot of resources. Resources meaning research, meaning political will, meaning our energy of always raising this issue. So I think it didn't come out of nowhere. It comes from the women's movement, which is, as we know, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. It's the oldest organization following issues related to war and security. So even when women were not allowed to become diplomats, because we know countries had ban against women in MFAs, and even when they were allowed, there was so-called the marriage ban, where women had to choose between a career in MFA or a marriage, and that was only lifted around the 70s in many countries, so it's all very recent history. Even there, women were always trying to present their demands and participate however they could, and most of the times it was in an unofficial capacity. And it's only in the past 5 years that women became 30% of diplomats. So I don't think, we have accumulated a lot, but I don't think we can say, oh, let's move to the next agenda because there's so much on gender already. I don't think so. So just to give a bit of history, this didn't come out of nowhere. It's been a long process in the making. And I think we have to recognize all the women's organizations and the gender equality organizations that have come before, and make sure we have the space today where we are comfortable addressing gender perspectives in the nuclear field, which wasn't the case, let's say 5 years ago, or, so it's all very recent. And I think, as Nomsa was saying, the fact of social media, internet, and interconnectedness, maybe, I don't know if it's true, it's easier to turn these conversations that before used to be only among experts now to a broader public. And the broader public has been interested in gender issues recently. also on climate, and also on youth empowerment. So I think these are all agendas which are high in the public agenda, and which makes sense for me to bring this to the arms control and disarmament space, because my personal perspective and perspective as a researcher is that we have only to gain when we are connecting agendas, and when we can strengthen synergies among agendas, and when we can break down policy silos, and we can make the best use of resources. So I think it makes complete sense to connect these issues. And I welcome all initiatives in this area as well. I just wanted to point that still gender is in the nuclear field is, and in foreign policy in general, is a relatively recent agenda. Before, it was like academics like Carol Cole who were publishing, and I don't think she got the reception that she has now in the 80s. She was ahead of her time in a way, and we're still catching up with that work still.
Thank you for saying that, Renata, because I want to just jump in here, Sebastian, and say, I had not heard of Carol Cohn's work, and I worked in the Conference on Disarmament, and I covered disarmament portfolio until I came to the Middlebury Institute to obtain my master's degree in non-proliferation and terrorism studies. And it was in my weapons of mass destruction course that her work was shared with me. And I was like, oh my goodness, all this time we've been using these jokes and analogies like within the diplomatic circles in disarmament to say, wow, some of this language, not knowing, I did not know. And I don't think most of my peers knew about this work that she had done. So I agree with Renata that, she's been the most cited very recently compared to when she published. And yeah, I just wanted to jump in and say that.
Uber, anything to add?
Yes, on that last point from Nomza, I'll just add that I try to, I'm trying to contribute to spread the word of Carol Cohn by giving it as a compulsory text for first years and honors students. I just wanted to say, so I'm thinking about two questions. So the first question on new campaigns that, for example, that address intersectionality, and also Emily's question, brilliant question, actually. Thank you so much, Emily. So I think they connect. So in a way, just looking at what Emily is saying here, it almost answers the first question on how do we, address intersectionality. And I think here, it's great that we're seeing a larger proportion now of women, people of color, and citizens of Global South in today's cohort. So how do we retain it? So I guess I can speak here from a little bit of more academia side, and I think everybody's familiar with how difficult it is to get a permanent job. And a lot of the time, it's fixed term contracts, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's quite discouraging, actually. So to keep diverse cohort, what we do need is more funding opportunities. For example, things like fundings for visa, etc. All this, this is where we start. This is how to maintain a cohort, because a lot of people just simply get discouraged because there are very few prospects of stable jobs, and a lot of the time, if you are required to travel, it's very difficult, just to move across the world for just 1 year. You need sufficient resources for that and sufficient guarantees that this is going to go somewhere. So I think this is where we start. And Nomza already replied, funding, support, mentorship, education. Exactly. This is what we need. And I think this answers both Emily's question and the question you posed, Sebastian, about intersectionality. And this, I keep saying mentoring education, but this is I think is the way forward. And I absolutely agree with you, Renata, in terms of that the work on gender is not done. It's only just beginning in many ways, and there's such a long road to go. So this, of course, by no means we should claim that that's done and we move on to something else. No, it's not done, and it's not going to be done anytime soon, unfortunately. So I think that's all. I'm not sure what was the third question. I don't think I noted it.
Well, I think we might have to wrap up at this point anyway, as we're getting to half past the hour. So, I mean, just to quickly say, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've thought about the sort of different ways we can look at diversity and inclusion within the field, and I hope everybody's been taking notes. I'd like to thank our three speakers, both for their insights today, but also for the work they've been doing, and it really makes a huge contribution to the field as a whole. And I'd like to thank RUSI, in particular Daria Dotsakova and Christina Variale for inviting us here today. And to all of you who are watching, thank you very much for coming and engaging. If you haven't read Carol Cohen's Sex and Death in the Rational World of Defense Intellectuals, 1987, I would highly recommend downloading the paper. It is a great read. And if I can leave you with all with a message, perhaps even a kind of call to action, it's to invite you to be ambassadors for diversity and inclusion in your organizations. And particularly if you're a senior leader in the field and you're not a member of the Gender Champions in Nuclear Policy Initiative, I'd call on you to join up, eschew manels, make some pledges, and wear the badge proudly. So with